The economic growth in Brazil has been quite good over the last 6-8 years, with a small blip in 2009 because of the global recession. But if we go back to 2004, that was the year in which the Brazilian economy started to pick up and to reach significant rapid rates of growth. This came to 2010 when the economy hit the 7.6% rate of growth, which was similar to the Asian economies. Nonetheless, in 2011 it wasn't that good, and in 2012 we have noticed a significant slowdown in the economy. Having said that, we need to recognize that the macroeconomic situation of Brazil is still solid, and the factors that have accounted for this are still in place. Namely, the fact that in Brazil over the last 8 years there has been an emergence of a new middle class, 30 million new middle class Brazilian spending, consuming more. And in fact, one of the major drivers of economic growth in Brazil over the last decade is the domestic market and the presence of this very large and fast-growing middle class. Brazil is a country with a lot of opportunities, but the business environment is quite complex and is not easy to navigate. If I'm going to mention factors that impact on the ability or the difficulty to operate in Brazil, I mentioned among those a heavy taxation. Brazil is a country which has a 36%, taxation represents 36% of GDP, which is quite similar to the Western economies of the UK. That is quite unusual because in Latin America, the average tax take is about 18% of GDP. Secondly, the labor market in Brazil is quite inflexible and the labor cost quite high. It's not easy to fire workers in Brazil. The workers are heavily protected, and there is a lot of benefits in addition to that adds even more to cost. And also is the fact that the infrastructure and other areas of Brazil are not up to scratch, and for that reason costs are even higher. So those factors need to be taken into consideration when investing in Brazil. And for that reason, it's also important to mention that another factor which is significantly important for any foreign investor is the increasing intervention of the state in the economy, the protection of national champions, and the meddling in the economy in different ways, mostly through regulations. In fact, one of the most often questions asked by clients is how to operate in a country where regulation is quite heavy. Infrastructure is one of the main downsides of the Brazilian economy. It's a country which for the last 30 years there hasn't been a significant investment in this sector. So you have very badly run roads, you have inefficient and not sufficient ports, you have airports which are extremely crowded and really need to be developed and expanded, and all this is constraining significantly the growth of the economy, particularly when there is a huge demand for everything that Brazil produces. If we take, for example, soya, of which Brazil is possibly the largest world producer, is the cheapest in terms of production cost on the ground at the farm, but when it reaches the port of Santos, you need to add possibly 50% of cost only in transportation. So when it goes to the international markets, soya in Brazil is as expensive as the soya from the United States. So there is a problem for competitiveness, and Brazil really need to address this. And recently, President Rousseff unveiled a plan of 63 billion to develop, expand, and overhaul the infrastructure. Heavy taxation is possibly one of the most important hurdles to operate in Brazil. We have looked at different projects. Exclusive analysis in particular have been looking into assessing political risk in Brazil. And one of the questions that come from clients is how can we deal with level of taxation that actually is making the cost production extremely high. The government is responding to that not in a aggressive manner, but rather in a selected manner by offering tax subsidies on selective basis. To give an example, for computer industry, there has been offered a special tax rebates on the condition that they invest in certain areas and on the condition that they generate certain amount of employment. There has been also some lift in taxation in sectors like manufacturing. There have also been some offers of reducing taxation for car companies, but in general taxation is an issue that Brazil needs to address, and possibly is addressing it in a way which is extremely selective and not in a structural manner, and that for us is going to be quite problematic in the next few years. Regulatory risk is a very important issue for the oil industry. One of the reasons for this is that the main goal of the previous government of President Lula and President Rousseff, the current government, is that at the same time that they are going to develop the oil industry and they're going to increase oil production, possibly to double that in 5 years, they're going to use that to develop ancillary industries that are not necessarily directly oil industries. So suppliers of different type of goods for the oil industry are going to be encouraged, and as a result of that, any foreign company operating in the oil industry in Brazil is going to be expected that at least 65% of the input they're going to use in their operation have to be bought locally. This is problematic for foreign companies for several reasons. One of those is that you normally could get cheaper inputs, cheaper supplies elsewhere internationally. So if the government demands that you have to source 65% of that input locally, it will add to your production costs. Secondly, there is a problem of delivery, and it's not necessarily the case that the Brazilian company will be as efficient to deliver anything you need. So we think that some flexibility will be in place, but in general, the policy that local content has to be embedded in any oil operation is a policy that is non-negotiable and is going to be there constantly as a factor in Brazil business environment.